On October 24, 1907, a working man reached his bank window and was told his cash was not available. Hours later, private promises were made behind closed doors by men the public was supposed to trust, while no one voted and no one protested. The victim is not a single famous name. It is the ordinary depositor who did everything the system asked, earned wages, carried a passbook, trusted a counter and a signature, and still watched access to his own money disappear in a single day. The central act of injustice is simple. During the panic of 1907, millions were forced to absorb the shock in public, while the terms of rescue were negotiated in private. The people who benefited were not the ones standing in line. Control shifted to the men who could summon a room, dictate conditions, and decide what would be supported and what would be left to fail. One concrete piece of evidence anchors the moment, October 24, 1907, when J.P. Morgan convened leaders of major banks and trust companies in a closed meeting and demanded an immediate agreement, an intervention that shaped outcomes far beyond that room. This film will show how that transfer of power could happen without a public vote, without a visible scandal, and with reputations intact. To understand why that matters, you have to strip away the comforting headline language. Newspapers could call it panic, as if the problem were emotion in the street, an unpredictable stampede. Panic is a word that puts blame on crowds. It makes the crisis sound like a natural event, like weather, rather than a sequence of decisions, priorities, and protections. But the true cut is not made in the open. It is made in the moment liquidity becomes selective. When cash is scarce, the first question is not how do we calm the public, but who gets access first. In 1907, that question was answered quietly, often before the day ended, while clerks repeated rehearsed phrases at windows and doors. The public saw lines, shuttered trust offices, and anxious merchants. They saw working families doing what the rules said to do, waiting. What they did not see, because they were not allowed to see it, was the room where the hierarchy of survival was drafted. The panic of 1907 was not a rumor. It was a real financial breakdown tied to real institutions and real consequences. Trust companies, private financial firms that had grown powerful outside the traditional banking system, faced sudden runs as confidence collapsed. When confidence breaks, it does not break evenly. It breaks along seams of access. A well-connected institution can borrow, a smaller firm cannot. A depositor hears later, a merchant hears credit tightened, an employer hears payroll at risk. By the time the public understands the scope, the private architecture of rescue is already forming. And when rescue is private, it is also discretionary. It carries terms. It chooses which names are protected and which are allowed to become examples. This is where the story begins, not with spectacle, but with governance, without ballots. On October 24, 1907, Morgan did not hold a press conference. He did not ask permission from voters. He convened the men who could move capital and demanded a settlement that would stabilize what he considered essential. There is no romance in this. There is only urgency and authority, an informal command structure taking shape because formal structures were not designed to respond quickly, and because the people who held the most leverage preferred it that way. The public, meanwhile, received the performance of normalcy, statements meant for print, reassurance meant to prevent further runs, and the implication that this was an unfortunate moment that respectable leadership was handling. Respectability is part of the mechanism. Money in this era was inseparable from reputation. The appearance of solvency, the narrative of prudence, the idea that the most prominent men were guardians of stability. In 1907, image mattered. because confidence was fragile and the press could amplify panic or suppress it. But reputation also provided cover. If the right names were associated with saving the system, then the public could be guided to accept the outcome as necessary, even virtuous, without ever learning who was asked to absorb the cost. That is how a moral framing is built. Control is presented as stewardship, and emergency decisions are presented as public service, even when the public is excluded from the room. The human impact is not abstract. It sits in the smallest humiliations: the man who cannot withdraw cash for rent, the shopkeeper who cannot restock because suppliers demand payment, the clerk whose employer shortens hours, the family that watches a week's stability turn into a question mark. In crises, the most damaging loss is often not money itself, but agency, the ability to decide, to act, to protect one's own household. In 1907, agency was removed in plain sight for those at the bottom and restored quickly for those at the top. That contrast is the core tension of this documentary. A public story of disorder paired with a private story of allocation. And that tension is not merely historical. It exposes a pattern that repeats whenever systems rely on confidence but concentrate access. If the solution to instability depends on closed rooms, the winners and losers are not accidents. They are selected outcomes. Yet selection can be disguised as inevitability. It can be wrapped in the language of emergency. It can be softened by the press's focus on panic rather than power. It can be protected by legacy, the names that survive in biographies and institutions, polished into guardianship, while the people who paid the price remain anonymous by design. If you want to understand who paid for the rescue while others were protected, you have to follow the trail that the headlines do not offer. The meeting, the demands, the conditions, and the quiet lines that separate. Supported from abandoned. And you have to treat the absence of outrage as a clue, not as proof that nothing unfair occurred. If you want ongoing access to the closed-door record, subscribe to Beyond the Golden Halls. And if this kind of hidden governance deserves an intellectual reaction, leave a like. We are not chasing drama, we are tracing authority. Because the first injustice of the panic of 1907 is not that fear spread, it is that decisions affecting millions were made as though the public were a bystander. The public watched doors and windows. The real negotiation happened elsewhere, and somewhere in that separation between what was seen and what was decided, the bill was assigned. One step from here is a document you cannot read from the street, a set of terms you cannot vote on, a ledger you cannot inspect. The next sound in this story is not a shout, but a pen on paper. On October 22, 1907, the damage stopped looking like a rumor and became a posted fact. The Knickerbocker Trust Company did not struggle, did not waver, did not face headwinds. It suspended operations. That phrase belongs to administrative language, the kind that pretends a decision is merely a condition. But for the people who walked toward its doors that morning, suspension meant something more direct. The public's permission to believe was revoked, and it was revoked without warning, without a hearing, and without any obligation to explain who made the final call to let the institution stand alone. What matters here is not the spectacle of a crowd. It is the moment support is withdrawn as a choice. In a panic, money does not vanish evenly. It moves toward the places that can still demand it. A trust company was supposed to be respectable, an address, a name, a quiet promise of safekeeping. But in 1907, it sat on a structural fault line. Trust companies carried deposits and made loans, but they did not operate inside the same protective machinery as the core banks. Their reserves were often thinner. Their access to emergency lending was not guaranteed. Their legitimacy depended on confidence more than cash, and confidence was not a neutral substance. It was granted, reaffirmed, or removed by other institutions that understood exactly what a refusal would signal. The action of power in this block is not dramatic. It is a restriction. The moment interbank support is withheld, the institution is reclassified in the market's mind from temporarily strained to unsafe. That reclassification does not require a public announcement. It can happen through silence, through a closed meeting, through a refusal to extend credit lines that had existed the day before. In 1907, a large trust company could appear stable to its depositors until it was suddenly treated as a liability by the financial system around it. And once that treatment begins, the logic becomes self-fulfilling. The more the institution needs help, the more costly it becomes for others to be seen helping it. The public does not vote on that calculus. The public only feels its consequences. Knickerbocker's suspension was the kind of event that turns fear into instruction. Before that date, a depositor could still tell himself the panic was happening somewhere else, in the papers, in the stock market, among speculators. After that date, the panic had an address. A big name went down, and suddenly every other name became suspect by association. This is how institutional victimhood works in a financial crisis. The victim is not just the firm, it is the trust that ordinary people use to navigate a system they cannot audit. When that trust is removed, it does not come back through reassurance. It comes back only through proof, and proof is expensive. The day Knickerbocker suspended operations, the public learned a lesson it had not agreed to learn. Liquidity is not a right. It is a privilege that can be reassigned. A bank teller can look you in the eye and still be powerless because the decision was made elsewhere earlier by people whose names will not appear on a posted notice. The depositor becomes an afterthought. The merchant becomes collateral damage. The wage earner becomes a statistic, except no one prints the statistics in real time. What gets printed is the language of inevitability, a loss of confidence, unfavorable conditions, a temporary measure. The institution's failure is framed as a weather event. The act of withdrawal, the decision by other institutions to stand back, is framed as prudence. And that withdrawal does not merely end one firm's day. It creates a chain reaction because trust companies were intertwined with the city's daily circulation of money. They were lenders, they were cash managers, they were places where businesses kept working balances and where families kept what little they could protect from the volatility of wages and rent. When one large trust company is seen as unsupported, every depositor begins asking the same question. If it can happen there, why not here? The market interprets the fall of a recognizable institution as a signal that the safety net is not universal. The signal is louder than any editorial. There is a difference between a crisis and a judgment. A crisis is uncertainty. A judgment is selection. On October 22, 1907, Knickerbocker's suspension functioned as a judgment on the category of trust company itself. It told the public that some institutions would be defended and others would be isolated. It told smaller firms that the cost of survival would rise instantly. It told depositors that their role in the system was to provide stability on the way up and absorb instability on the way down. Most importantly, it created the conditions for private command decisions to look like public necessity. Once the panic widens, intervention can be framed as rescue rather than control. That framing is the opening elites need. This is where the investigative problem becomes concrete. If a trust company was vulnerable by structure, the question is not simply, why did it collapse? The question is, who decided it would not be carried? In a system built on interdependence, collapse is rarely solitary. Support is either extended, delayed, conditioned, or denied. Those are actions. They are choices made inside rooms that do not include the people most affected. When a major institution suspends operations, it is tempting to treat it as the end of a story, an inevitable failure caused by mismanagement or market forces. But the records that matter here are the ones that describe the moment the institution became untouchable. The refusals, the hesitations, the reassessments made by counterparties who had the authority to prevent a public shock and chose instead to contain their own risk. Even the language of vulnerability can be used to disguise responsibility. Yes, trust companies were structurally exposed. That is true. But structure does not decide timing. Structure does not decide whether an institution receives temporary relief or a public death sentence. Structure does not decide whether a crisis is allowed to spread until the terms of rescue can be dictated by a small circle. Those decisions live in the grey space between formal policy and informal power, where reputations are preserved by acting quietly, where newspapers are fed a story that reduces agency to atmosphere, and where the public is expected to accept that harm is simply the price of restoring order. Knickerbocker's suspension also changes the moral geometry of the city. Before the doors close, the depositor's posture is private. He assumes his money is his. After the doors close, his posture becomes public. He must stand in line. He must ask. He must wait for permission. That shift is not just economic, it is civic. It tells people that their relationship to the financial system is not one of mutual obligation, but one of dependency. And dependency creates silence. Because those who depend do not accuse easily. They fear being blamed for causing more panic. They fear being treated as irrational. They fear the humiliation of being told they should have known better, even though the system was designed so they could not know. The consequence is measurable, even if it is not evenly recorded. Contagion. Once Knickerbocker suspends operations, other trust companies come under suspicion, and depositors behave rationally within an irrational environment. They withdraw because they cannot verify. They move funds because they do not want to be the last to learn that support has been quietly reassigned. This behavior is blamed as panic, but it is a form of self-defense in a system where information is controlled by those with the least incentive to disclose it. The public's fear becomes both a symptom and a tool. It can be cited as the reason extraordinary private measures are required. It can be used to justify why decisions must be made quickly, off the record, without debate. And this is where the chain of power begins to show its outline. The crisis needs a focal point, someone to coordinate, to impose terms, to choose what lives and what dies. But the focal point cannot appear as a ruler. It must appear as a stabilizer. Knickerbocker's suspension provides the necessary pretext. Once a prominent institution has fallen, the city can be told it is in an emergency beyond normal procedure. Emergency language is how control is introduced. Without confessing it, it allows meetings to be held in private that would have seemed unacceptable in calm times. It allows the distribution of liquidity to be presented as triage rather than preference. It allows the winners to be described as systemically important and the losers to be described as unfortunate. The investigative point of this block is not to romanticize the trust company as innocent. The point is to identify the moment the public's trust is treated as expendable, because once that happens, the public can be managed as a variable rather than served as a constituency. The victim becomes institutional. Confidence itself is withdrawn, and withdrawn in a way that tells the public there will be no transparent accounting. The city is left with a hollow choice: either accept private stabilization on private terms, or endure a widening collapse that will punish the least protected first. That is not a choice offered by law. It is a choice imposed by circumstance. And circumstance is often manufactured by those who can afford delay. By the end of October 22, 1907, the crisis is no longer a story about markets. It is a story about access. Who can obtain cash before the day closes? Who can roll over loans? Who can call in favors? Who can survive a week of frozen confidence? The difference between survival and ruin is not moral character. It is position. It is proximity to the rooms where decisions are made. The next step in this investigation is not to watch another line form. It is to follow the shift from public fear to private command, how the suspension of one institution becomes the justification for a closed-door agreement that will decide in advance who will be carried and who will be allowed to fall. For now, the only visible artifact is ordinary and brutal: a locked entrance, an official notice posted at eye level, and the quiet understanding that a public promise has been revoked by someone whose signature is not on the page. On October 23, 1907, New York did not recover. It reorganized. What shifted that day was not the noise on the sidewalk, but the posture of the institutions above it. A committee structure began to behave like an emergency government, and it did so without ever asking the public to recognize it as one. The New York Clearing House, a private association meant to settle balances among member banks, became the room where permission was granted, denied, and quietly priced. The public would hear the soft language of stability and confidence, but the mechanism that mattered was administrative. Who would be treated as worth saving, and who would be allowed to absorb the panic as if it were their own fault? The action of power in this block is a decision exercised through conditions. On October 23, 1907, the Clearing House coordinated emergency measures and declared that support would not be universal. It would be conditional, and the conditions would be set by the Clearing House itself. Institutions were examined. Some were effectively certified as safe enough to be carried, and others were left outside the circle. That line was not written into public law. It was drawn by private governance at the moment ordinary people had the least ability to defend themselves. When cash is scarce and fear is contagious, a decision about who is acceptable is not a technical note. It is a verdict that reaches directly into the lives of depositors who never consented to this system of selection. In a city that ran on confidence, the Clearing House's most potent tool was not new money. It was classification. Confidence breaks first in the mind, then in the line, then at the window. A committee that can label an institution sound can slow a run without handing a depositor a single dollar. A committee that refuses to extend that label can turn a rumor into a final judgment. The villain in this part of the story does not need a face because it does not need emotion. It is a mechanism that operates cleanly inside respectable language: certified, examined, approved, acceptable collateral, member support. These words feel neutral. They are not. They decide where oxygen flows when the room is running out of air. This is where the trust companies, already exposed by the Knickerbocker Trust Company's suspension the day before, became victims in a second way. Their vulnerability was not only a matter of reserves, it was a matter of position. Trust companies sat adjacent to the core banking circle, but they did not inhabit the same membership machinery and did not possess the same automatic claim to collective defense. They could be prominent, even socially prestigious, and still be treated as outside the circle of institutions that must be defended to preserve the settlement network. That is why panic spreads faster after a big name falls. The public learns, in real time, that safety is not a principle, it is a status. The logic of rescue in 1907 was never save everyone. It was keep the payment system standing. From the perspective of the people trying to prevent collapse, that logic is coherent. Protect the institutions whose failure would disrupt settlement, freeze commerce, and force wider liquidation. The injustice is how that logic was applied, as private governance, replacing public criteria with internal standards during a moment when the consequences would land on the public first. A worker does not receive wages because payroll checks have to clear. A merchant cannot restock because credit lines are quietly tightened. A landlord demands rent in cash precisely when cash becomes harder to obtain. These are not abstractions. They are the everyday consequences of a committee deciding which pipes stay open. The language that survives from crisis governance is designed to sound neutral because neutrality discourages questions. Temporary measures suggests patience. Satisfactory condition suggests science. Assistance suggests generosity. But in practice, these terms were administrative cover for the key act. Support could be conditioned on compliance, and compliance meant submission to the clearinghouse's authority at precisely the moment when refusal could be fatal. A member bank could be told, in effect, that access to collective support required internal examination and adherence to standards that were never voted on by the people whose deposits were at stake. A non-member or a firm outside the favored circle could be left to face the crowd with no equivalent protection, even if its depositors were as innocent as anyone else in the city. On October 23rd, the clearinghouse moved from background plumbing to foreground authority. It could send examiners, coordinate member banks, and establish a shared posture that would look from the outside like the market speaking with one voice. But markets do not speak. People do. And the people speaking here were not disinterested referees. They were bankers protecting a structure that favored proximity and punished isolation. When they conditioned support on internal tests of acceptability, they were not only trying to stop a panic, they were asserting the right to decide who counted as part of the system at the exact moment the system was most valuable. Selection changes behavior in ways that deepen injustice. Because once support becomes conditional, institutions begin acting to satisfy conditions rather than to serve depositors. They restrict withdrawals to preserve the appearance of solvency. They tighten credit because acceptable collateral becomes narrower. They cut off counterparties that might contaminate them by association. Classification does not merely label institutions. It reshapes the city's economy from the inside out. The public is asked to remain calm, as if calm were a civic duty, while the real duty is being performed elsewhere, protecting the architecture that determines who receives relief first and who is required to wait. The press, intentionally or not, amplified this structure because reputation was currency. In 1907, to be publicly treated as sound was to receive not only liquidity, but legitimacy. A certification could change how editors wrote, how other institutions behaved, and how depositors judged risk. To be left uncertified was to become suspect by omission. Omission does not require accusation, it only requires silence, and silence is power when crowds are watching doors. A single public reassurance offered to one class of institution could redirect fear toward another class and make the redirection look rational. The public would interpret the message as information. In reality, it was also governance. The result of the clearinghouse's coordination was an invisible line the public could not see but could feel. On the protected side were institutions that could obtain time to settle, time to borrow, time to wait out the crowd. On the exposed side were institutions that had to face the crowd. With no guarantee of support, even if their depositors had done nothing but trust the name on a building. When one class of institution is treated as rescuable and another as sacrificable, panic spreads because the public learns that safety is not universal. It is allocated, and allocation in a crisis is power. By the end of October 23rd, the crisis began to look orderly from above. Order is not the same as justice. Order can be produced by choosing where pain will land and calling that choice discipline. The clearinghouse created a procedural justification for unequal protection. It could claim assistance was being provided where warranted, that stability required standards, that restraint was necessary. Those phrases hide the underlying decision. Certain institutions would be carried because their survival protected the core network of settlement and influence, while others could be left exposed because their failure was survivable for the people in control. The public, meanwhile, was expected to accept the outcomes as the natural result of confidence rising and falling, rather than the result of private criteria being enforced under pressure. Once a private line is drawn, it becomes precedent. It becomes portable. It can be carried into the next closed room, the next emergency meeting, the next agreement framed as necessary. Selection stops being an improvised response and becomes procedure. The city is taught to accept that unequal protection is simply how stability is restored. That is the villainous turn here. Not a single person, but a mechanism that turns help into authority to choose, authority exercised without ballots, without public minutes, and without any obligation to account to the people who pay the price. What remains unresolved, and what the public was never invited to see, is who could force final alignment when committee procedure was not enough, who had the standing to demand immediate agreement and override hesitation when the system threatened to fracture. The next day, October 24th, that question will narrow to a private room and a single demand that compresses this mechanism into one decisive moment. For now, the concrete image is quiet and final. A certification mark pressed into a ledger, ink drying beside an institution's name, while outside the door, a line of depositors waits with nothing but a passbook and the realization that rescue has become a method of selection. On the night of October 24, 1907, the public crisis was still being described as a loss of nerve, but the surviving record points to something more concrete. While depositors stood outside locked counters across the city, a small group of financial leaders gathered inside a private space that did not belong to the public at all. The Morgan Library and Museum, not a courthouse, not a public chamber, not a bank lobby, became the setting for commitments that would shape what the newspapers could later call restored confidence. The injustice is not hidden in a theory. It is visible in the geography. The decisions that mattered most were moved out of the city's shared institutions and into a room designed for private authority. What is plausible and verifiable is the broad outline, repeated across contemporary accounts and later administrative retellings. Senior figures were brought together under urgency. They were pressed to commit resources. And the pressure was not simply moral persuasion. It was institutional coercion, disguised as emergency discipline. A closed meeting can produce an outcome that looks like consensus because the people who can refuse are also the people who can be blamed for collapse. This is how private power converts fear into compliance. The mechanism does not require illegality, it requires control of the room. The closed-door element survives because it captures something that was administratively real, even if the exact choreography is debated. The idea that the meeting was not allowed to dissolve until commitments were secured. In the language of power, that is an act of restriction. Someone, at some point in that sequence of hours, sealed the process, whether literally with a locked door or functionally by refusing to release participants from responsibility. The effect is the same. A handful of men inside an elite space could impose a deadline on one another that the public could not impose on them. Deposit holders could not compel their own banks to pay out. Merchants could not compel credit to resume, but the people inside that room could compel each other to pledge support, because they controlled the only thing more valuable than cash that week: access to collective survival. The location matters because it changes what public means. A library is supposed to be a place of knowledge, a place where records endure. But this library was also a monument to one man's permanence, a physical signal that private wealth could build its own institutions, separate from civic oversight, and then treat those institutions as legitimate command centers in a crisis. When the press later described stabilization, it could describe it as leadership rather than private governance. A marble facade and a respected name make it easier to present control as stewardship. The public sees an address, not a vote. The public sees a benefactor's legacy, not the terms being imposed. This is where the mystery tightens rather than resolves. We can trace the pressure to commit. We can trace the outcome. We can trace the public-facing narrative that followed. What remains nebulous, because the process was built to leave minimal fingerprints, is the exact chain of proposition inside the room. Who introduced each term, who resisted, who yielded first, and what was threatened implicitly to secure agreement. In a public institution, those questions would be anchored by minutes, recorded votes, sworn testimony. In a private emergency meeting, the surviving record tends to harden into legend precisely because the administrative details were never meant for disclosure. The phrase, "the door was locked," becomes a clean story for a messy act. The conversion of a systemic crisis into a private negotiation whose legitimacy depended on speed, not transparency. The consequence was immediate and measurable, even if it was not explained in plain language. Once commitments were extracted, certain institutions gained time and liquidity, while others remained exposed. The city's financial landscape did not simply calm down. It was reorganized through private selection under pressure, with a social cost that did not appear on a single balance sheet. Wage earners and small depositors remained the shock absorbers. Their role was to wait, to accept limits, to trust statements issued after the fact. Meanwhile, the people in the room gained something rarer than money: the authority to define which failures were unacceptable and which were tolerable. That authority did not come from law. It came from position, and from a crisis severe enough that the public would accept outcomes it had no power to inspect. This is also where reputation becomes evidence. If the stabilization had depended on public scrutiny, the process would have required open justification. Instead, it depended on preserving the image of responsible leadership. The press could report that prominent bankers acted. It could report that measures were taken. It could point to a return of order as proof that the method had been necessary. But necessity is not the same as legitimacy. A closed room can manufacture necessity by delaying broader support until conditions are met, then presenting the eventual intervention as salvation. The public is told to be grateful. The public is not told what was demanded, what was conceded, and what was quietly written off. So the injustice remains active. The people most affected were not invited into the room where the threshold between rescue and sacrifice was decided. They experienced the panic as personal failure, couldn't withdraw, couldn't borrow, couldn't pay, while the real decisions were executed as private discipline among elites. The door matters because it marks the boundary. On one side, a public that could only react. On the other, a small circle that could impose terms and call the result stability. And yet the story still refuses to become fully documentary in the way a courtroom record would. The door is remembered. The precise sequence is contested. The legend grows because the administrative trail is thin by design. That thinness is not an accident. A process that changes outcomes for millions while avoiding public scandal has to leave room for ambiguity. Ambiguity protects reputations. It protects estates. It protects institutions that will outlive the depositors who stood in line. We end this block with a physical image, not an explanation. A heavy interior door in a private library, a lamp, burning late, paper on a polished table, and signatures or pledges extracted under the quiet force of confinement, while outside the city waits, and we still do not know which commitments were voluntary and which were compelled, only that the next morning some doors opened and others never truly did. On October 26th, 1907, while much of New York still reeled from sleepless nights and shuttered trust company doors, a decisive shift occurred in the mechanisms that defined survival. That morning, the Trust Company of America, one of the largest and most prominent trust institutions in the city, was under siege. Depositors were not simply uneasy. They were withdrawing funds in a manner that overwhelmed the institution's capacity to pay out in cash. The run was historic in both length and intensity, yet it was not simply a story of panic. It was, in that moment, a story of power exercised and choices made behind the scenes, a human decision that shaped who would stabilize and who would face ruin. Amid that chaos, the Trust Company of America received targeted support that would keep it open, but the circumstances of that intervention exposed the uneven nature of rescue and the deeper injustice at the heart of this crisis. Before October 26th, the institution had already endured days of incessant withdrawals. Depositors lined up outside its Wall Street headquarters, demanding cash they believed was rightfully theirs. They did not know and could not see that in private meetings, bankers and financiers were quietly assessing which institutions had the networks and reputations necessary to be sustained. In the morning papers that day, the Trust Company of America's challenges were described as part of the general panic in the city, the same way every other trust's difficulties were. What was not in the headlines was the action of power being exercised far from the public eye. An agreement among leading financiers to provide conditional support to the Trust Company of America so that it could stave off collapse for another day. The action was concrete. A consortium of financiers, led by J. Pierpont Morgan and joined by the presidents of major banks, extended resources and guarantees that would allow the Trust Company of America to meet immediate cash pressures. Those resources were not a government injection nor a measure subject to public debate. They were private commitments negotiated among men whose names rarely appeared in the broader narrative of the panic at that time. By agreeing to back the institution, these financiers altered the course of the day's events. Depositors could be assured, even if only temporarily, that their bank would remain open. For many, that was the difference between solvency and bankruptcy. Nothing about this support was unconditional. The notes from later testimonies and reports make clear that help arrived only because of a combination of reputational pressure and expectations of reciprocal compliance. The Trust Company of America was audited, and its books were examined before support was extended, even as competing firms suffered shorter shrift. The men who controlled the flow of emergency resources did not base their decisions on an egalitarian principle of public good. They based them on networks of influence, shared interests, and the perceived systemic value of the institution in question. The Trust Company of America survived because its backers judged it in a condition worthy of saving: judgment. being the precise power that others so visibly lacked when their doors were closed and their depositors were left with nothing. The consequence of this targeted intervention was not simply partial stabilization. It was the institutionalization of prioritization. Banks and trust companies that could secure this network of support gained an artificial breathing space, while those that could not were left to face their fate in full view of their withdrawing customers. As a result, the credit that should have been available to commerce and trade became intermittent and uneven. Merchants learned that access to liquidity was not a universal right, but a privilege determined by connections honed at private meetings held in the darkest hours of the crisis. The financial landscape was no longer defined by solvency alone. It was now shaped by proximity to collective power and the willingness of elites to extend it. Behind it all was the uncomfortable truth that in the middle of what the public moaned over as a panic, a kind of triage was taking place. The Trust Company of America's partial rescue was not merely a financial operation. It was an act of selection, a process of determining whose collapse would be a catastrophe and whose endurance was deemed valuable enough to underwrite. That the public perceived this only as a stabilization is itself part of the injustice. Depositors at smaller institutions or those beyond the inner circle of support had no say in their own fate, even as they shouldered equal blame for the crisis at large, and yet even this intervention could not erase the visible signs of strain. Following the commitment of funds, lines of depositors still stretched around blocks. Credit did not return evenly. Businesses reliant on smaller or unsupported trust institutions found that credit disappeared, wages tightened, and open doors closed. It was not simply a financial malfunction. It was a division of fate, where some survived with the backing of wealth and position, and others suffered the reality of exclusion. For the Trust Company of America itself, the stabilization came with social and reputational costs. Surviving the crisis did not mean thriving. It meant accepting conditions that altered its operations and changed how it was perceived by both peers and consumers. The institution that once stood as a bastion of stability became, in the eyes of many, a beneficiary of privilege rather than a defender of public trust. That shift in perception, slow though it may have been, spawned whispers that reach into later debates about why the public should ever be compelled to trust institutions that could be selectively supported at the whim of a few. The tension sharpened further because this assistance occurred while other trust companies were still faltering and waiting for help that never came with equal urgency. For depositors at those firms, the sight of resources flowing into the Trust Company of America, with its network of elite backing, was not a reassurance, but a cruel evidence of inequality, and it stands as an unresolved question. Why was help extended here, and not for others with similar risk profiles? At the close of October 26th, the financial corridors whispered of stabilization, even as the broader public endured its own stark reality. The Trust Company of America remained open, its doors unlocked for a while longer, its reputation reshaped by this marked intervention. Meanwhile, the memory of other institutions that could not command the same backing faded from the front pages, their depositors scattered, their credit lines dry, their doors shut for good. The next stage of this investigation must follow not just the shifting fortunes of institutions, but the flow of power itself, and how private networks could determine outcomes for millions with no public mandate. The image that remains is simple: a bank facade still open at dusk, lights burning late into the night, and in the distance the silent outline of closed doors that never reopened. On October 25, 1907, while private commitments were still being extracted in New York, The crisis crossed an invisible constitutional line. The panic was no longer confined to banks and trust companies. It had become a matter of federal credibility. That morning, the names that mattered were not only financiers, but Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, and George B. Cortelyou, Secretary of the Treasury. Their involvement did not erase the private command structure already in motion. It exposed its limits. The action of power here was not theatrical. It was administrative and precise. On October 25th, George B. Cortelyou reassigned federal Treasury funds to selected New York banks, depositing government money to increase available reserves and signal public backing. This was not an abstract endorsement. It was a concrete transfer of liquidity, executed under executive authority, intended to calm the market. At the same time, President Roosevelt maintained communication with financial leaders, carefully calibrating public tone so that no statement from Washington would ignite further withdrawals. The consequence was immediate. The federal government appeared to stand behind stabilization efforts, reinforcing confidence just as private networks were tightening their own lines of support. But this appearance carried a structural tension. The federal government in 1907 did not possess a central bank capable of systematically managing liquidity. There was no Federal Reserve. The institutional architecture was fragmented, and the Treasury's capacity to intervene was limited and reactive. The presence of Roosevelt and Cortelyou in the crisis did not mean the government was directing events. It meant that the government had entered a space where direction was already being exercised elsewhere. Public authority moved into alignment with private coordination because there was no independent mechanism strong enough to replace it. The injustice embedded in this alignment is subtle but measurable. When Cortelyou deposited funds into selected institutions, he did not distribute federal support evenly across every trust company under stress. He did not announce a universal guarantee for depositors. The action was targeted. It reinforced the same principle already at work in the clearinghouse and in the Morgan Library meetings: triage. Institutions deemed central or viable received breathing room. Others remained vulnerable. The federal imprimatur did not dismantle the line between rescuable and sacrificable. It stabilized that line. Roosevelt understood the volatility of words. In 1907, a presidential phrase could move markets more rapidly than any telegram. Silence, therefore, became a tool. Public statements were measured. Panic was not to be validated. At the same time, private conversations continued between political leadership and financial operators. The government could not afford to appear subordinate to Wall Street, but it also could not afford to let Wall Street fracture. The result was a coordination that blurred the boundary between state and private power. Official authority entered the room, but it did not seize the table. It reinforced the existing arrangement. This is where the investigative line tightens. Where does government end and private solution begin in 1907? The answer is not rhetorical. It is architectural. Without a central banking institution capable of acting independently, the federal government depended on informal channels to execute stabilization quickly. Cortelyou's Treasury deposits were meaningful, but they operated inside a network of private commitments already negotiated. The government did not replace the operator at the center of the system. It supplemented him, and that supplementation had consequences. The consequence was institutional precedent. By aligning federal funds with private coordination, the crisis resolution signaled that in moments of systemic fear, legitimacy would flow through a hybrid channel. Private decision first, public reinforcement second. Depositors did not vote on that architecture, Merchants did not consent to it, yet their livelihoods depended on its success. The architecture favored proximity. Those institutions already positioned within the inner circle could convert political endorsement into survival. Those outside the circle remained dependent on whether private actors considered them worth extending support to. The urgency of credibility dominated every calculation. A single misstep, a careless remark from the president, a poorly timed statement from the Treasury, could trigger another wave of withdrawals. That fragility explains the coordination, but it does not erase the structural imbalance. Government presence stabilized confidence, but it did not democratize decision-making. It did not transform emergency governance into a public deliberation. Instead, it ratified the framework in which stabilization depended on the ability of a few central operators to extract commitments from others. There is a moral asymmetry here. The public bore the risk of collapse. Workers risked wages. Small businesses risked bankruptcy. Depositors risked savings accumulated over years. Yet the decisive conversations occurred in rooms they would never enter. When Roosevelt and Cortelyou entered the narrative, the story acquired a national dimension, but it did not become transparent. The federal government's role was supportive rather than directive. It was, in effect, lending credibility to a private mechanism because no statutory alternative existed. The result was partial stabilization. Markets did not implode. Certain trust companies remained open. Federal deposits increased available reserves. But the architecture of selection endured. The distinction between institutions protected by coordinated support and those left to confront public withdrawals alone did not vanish. It hardened. The crisis demonstrated that in the absence of formal central banking authority, private operators could function as de facto stabilizers, with the federal government acting as reinforcement rather than command. The deeper investigative question emerges from this arrangement. Why was the institutional design of the United States in 1907 insufficient without an informal operator at the center? The answer points toward what would come later, the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, but in October 1907, that system did not yet exist. The gap between constitutional authority and financial necessity was filled by personal networks and reputational capital. That gap is where injustice lives, because networks are not accountable in the same way institutions are. On October 25th, the government's entry into the crisis did not displace private power. It validated it. Federal funds reinforced private commitments. Public credibility amplified private selection. The boundaries between state and market blurred under the pressure of necessity, and the public was told that order had been restored. Order, however, is not neutrality. It is a configuration of power that determines whose losses are absorbed and whose are cushioned. As the evening of October 25th settled over Washington and New York, telegraph wires carried carefully phrased reassurances. Treasury deposits were recorded in ledgers. Lines outside certain banks shortened slightly. The facade of coordinated authority held, yet the underlying tension remained unresolved. Stabilization depended not on a transparent institutional mandate, but on a collaboration between federal authority and private command that the public could not see. The image that remains is divided. A presidential desk in Washington with correspondence laid out in measured order, and in New York, the glow of lamps in private offices where commitments were being tallied. Two centers of authority linked by urgency, neither fully accountable to the depositors who waited outside locked doors, and both converging toward a system that would soon require a more permanent solution. By November 1907, the headlines had shifted tone. The word panic began to give way to stability, and the financial press cautiously described a return of confidence. But in New York City, the measurable effects of the rescue were no longer unfolding in marble libraries or executive offices. They were unfolding in workshops, storefronts, boarding houses, and factory floors. The crisis had been contained at the top. It had not been absorbed at the bottom. What stabilized the system did not restore the lives already constricted by it. The action of power that defines this month was not loud, it was administrative and diffuse. Banks across the city, including those operating under the coordination of the New York Clearinghouse, restricted credit lines to commercial borrowers, quietly reducing exposure to preserve their own balance sheets. This restriction was not announced as punishment, it was presented as prudence. Yet the consequence was immediate and concrete. Merchants who depended on short-term loans to restock inventory were denied renewal. Small manufacturers who relied on revolving credit found it tightened or withdrawn. Payrolls that had once moved on a predictable rhythm began to stall. The injustice embedded here is structural, not rhetorical. The institutions that had been judged rescuable were granted time and liquidity. They survived the acute phase of the crisis, but the preservation of their solvency required contraction elsewhere. The very act of stabilization demanded that someone absorb the shock, that someone was not the committee that had extracted commitments on October 24th. It was the diffuse network of wage earners and small proprietors whose survival depended on fluid credit. The design of the system did not require their signatures on any agreement. It required only their compliance with its consequences. In November 1907, bankruptcy filings in New York rose sharply, not because every business had been reckless, but because liquidity had become selective. A merchant whose bank survived the run still faced a new reality. Terms had changed. Credit was extended more cautiously. Collateral requirements hardened. Relationships that had once functioned on trust were re-evaluated under stress. The decision to restrict lending was made. Inside institutions seeking to protect capital, the social consequence was unemployment. Factories shortened hours. Construction slowed. Dock workers were dismissed when shipments declined. These were not sensational collapses. They were incremental erosions of income that rarely appeared in celebratory accounts of stabilization. The distinction between protected and exposed now moved from institutions to individuals. A depositor at a stabilized trust company might regain access to funds. A laborer employed by a firm dependent on now-vanished credit had no equivalent recourse. The system did not operate on moral merit. It operated on connectivity. Those attached to institutions deemed essential were buffered. Those whose livelihoods depended on the outer rings of liquidity bore the secondary impact. This was not framed as sacrifice. It was framed as adjustment. New York City itself felt the contraction. Municipal projects slowed as bond markets tightened. Real estate transactions declined. Retail activity fell. The city's economic pulse weakened in a way that could not be reversed by a single meeting or treasury deposit. The architecture that had prevented a total financial collapse could not prevent recessionary aftershocks. The rescue, engineered under pressure, had redistributed risk rather than eliminated it. The human cost rarely appeared in official summaries. Newspapers reported on banking conferences and the restoration of market calm. They did not print long lists of small businesses forced to close because suppliers demanded cash payment where credit had once sufficed. They did not dwell on families who deferred rent or postponed purchases indefinitely. The invisibility of these costs is part of the investigative problem. The stabilization narrative emphasizes what did not happen, a systemic implosion. It obscures what did happen, localized hardship, silent bankruptcies, interrupted livelihoods. In administrative terms, the crisis resolution was considered effective. Major banks remained solvent. The payment system resumed function. Confidence, measured in deposits and market prices, gradually returned. But administrative success and social equity are not identical measures. When credit was restricted to protect institutional survival, control shifted further upward. The power to decide who would receive financing in the new environment became concentrated in fewer hands. That concentration had long-term implications. It hardened the hierarchy between those inside the core of financial trust and those at its margins. By mid-November 1907, wage earners in sectors tied to construction and manufacturing were reporting reduced hours. Some employers delayed payment, citing uncertainty in collections. These were not isolated anecdotes, they were systemic ripples. A credit contraction at the top translates into wage contraction below. And because wages represent the primary means of survival for most households, the cost of financial engineering ultimately settles in kitchens and rent envelopes. The question that opened this investigation returns here with weight. Who paid the price for the panic of 1907 while others were protected? The answer is not found in a single ledger. It is distributed across households that had no seat at the table where commitments were extracted. It is found in small enterprises that could not secure the same reputational backing as the Trust Company of America. It is found in the Yossi distinction between institutions deemed too central to fail and communities deemed resilient enough to absorb loss. This is not moralism. It is system design. A financial structure that concentrates rescue authority among a few central operators will inevitably distribute consequences unevenly. Those operators may believe they are preserving the greater good, yet the greater good, defined narrowly as institutional continuity, does not account for the cumulative burden borne by those outside the room. Stabilization protects the architecture. It does not guarantee justice. The effect in New York City was not visible as a single catastrophe. It was visible as attrition. Storefronts closed quietly. Employment notices thinned. Savings diminished. Families adapted, reduced, postponed. None of these events required formal acknowledgement in the celebratory language of recovery, but together they form the unrecorded column in the ledger of 1907, the social cost of selective salvation. And so, the image that remains is not a locked library door or a treasury ledger. It is a dim storefront in November, inventory unsold, credit withdrawn, a clerk dismissed at the end of the week because orders have slowed. The financial system survived. The question that lingers is not whether collapse was avoided, but whether survival, as engineered, required invisible signatures from those who never agreed to pay. By 1908, the urgency had faded from the streets of New York City, but something more. Durable had begun to harden in Washington. The panic was no longer described as an emergency, it was being described as a lesson. And that change in language was not accidental. It was political architecture taking shape. At the center of that architecture stood Nelson W. Aldrich, United States Senator and Chairman of the newly established National Monetary Commission. His mandate was framed as technical: study the causes of the panic of 1907 and propose structural reforms. But the deeper action of power was narrative. Aldrich did not merely investigate the crisis, he reframed it, and in doing so, he altered what the country would remember. The shift is visible in tone. In late 1907, newspapers spoke of panic, collapse, desperation. By 1908, the language moved toward institutional insufficiency and systemic modernization. The problem was no longer described as selective salvation or asymmetrical exposure. It became a matter of outdated banking structure, fragmented reserves, and the absence of centralized coordination. These were real deficiencies, but the reframing accomplished something precise. It moved the public gaze away from who was protected and who was sacrificed, and toward what institutional mechanism might prevent future instability. The narrative migrated from moral imbalance to structural reform. In 1908, with the passage of the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, the National Monetary Commission was formally empowered to study banking systems in Europe and recommend changes for the United States. That legislative action was presented as a rational response to crisis, and it was rational. But it also functioned as a consolidation of interpretation by defining the crisis as a failure of system design rather than a demonstration of selective private power. The official narrative stabilized reputations. The Panic of 1907 became evidence of institutional inadequacy, not of private command exercised without public consent. The action of power here was not a coercion, it was classification. Through hearings, reports, and official language, Aldrich and the Commission altered the framing of the Panic of 1907 from a story of private rescue under pressure to a story of national monetary evolution. That alteration had consequences. It shaped what Congress debated. It shaped what newspapers amplified. It shaped what the public was invited to fear in the future. The villain became inefficiency, not discretion. The solution became centralization, not accountability for selective intervention. This is where silence becomes visible. Silence is not the absence of speech. It is the management of emphasis. The Commission's reports documented the instability of the American banking system and compared it unfavorably to European central banking structures. They catalogued reserve fragmentation and liquidity shortages. What they did not dwell on were the asymmetrical burdens carried by wage earners, the merchants denied renewal of credit, the trust companies abandoned because they lacked the correct proximity to coordinated power. Those elements did not vanish from history. They were simply relegated to footnotes, absorbed into broader categories like commercial contraction and temporary unemployment. The cost of stabilization, the families who reduced meals, the small businesses that never reopened, did not fit easily into the forward-looking narrative of reform. And reform requires optimism. It requires a belief that the next architecture will prevent recurrence. That belief does not thrive in a story about uneven protection and private selection. So the narrative was edited in real time. The panic became the necessary catalyst for progress. The men who had coordinated emergency measures were recast as precursors to institutional modernization. The crisis became a proving ground, not a moral reckoning. This reframing carried legal and institutional consequences. The Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908 authorized national banks to issue emergency currency backed by various forms of collateral. That measure was described as a safeguard against future panics. It was, in effect, a partial acknowledgement that liquidity could not depend solely on private agreements in closed rooms. Yet the Act did not interrogate the distributional consequences of the 1907 rescue. It did not question why certain institutions were saved while others were allowed to collapse. It addressed liquidity supply, not accountability. The result was a public memory that emphasized design failure over discretionary power. By 1909, the Panic of 1907 was already being cited primarily as evidence for the need for a central bank. The focus shifted toward efficiency and resilience. That shift was not incorrect, it was incomplete, and incompleteness is the most durable form of silence. The asymmetry of 1907 became abstracted into statistics and comparative charts. European central banks were studied for their elasticity of currency and their ability to function as lenders of last resort. These were valid inquiries, but they also allowed the country to move forward without fully confronting the lived experience of those who bore the cost of selective stabilization. The conversation advanced from who paid to how to prevent recurrence. The former question is moral, the latter is institutional. Institutions prefer the latter. Nelson W. Aldrich did not erase the past. He reorganized it. The panic of 1907 became the intellectual seedbed for what would eventually culminate in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. In that transformation, the crisis was memorialized as a structural turning point. Its human inequities were subsumed into broader categories of economic adjustment. The silence was not imposed by censorship, it was produced by prioritization. The danger of this silence is not historical inaccuracy, it is moral displacement. When crises are remembered primarily as catalysts for reform, the uneven suffering that accompanied them becomes background noise. The public is invited to celebrate progress without re-examining the distribution of pain that made reform politically inevitable. By reframing panic as lesson and lesson as necessity, the narrative absolves the mechanisms that selected winners and losers under pressure. And so the final image of 1908 is not a run on a bank or a locked library door. It is a printed report bound in formal type, pages turning from testimony to recommendation, language shifting from urgency to analysis. The panic of 1907 is reclassified as history. The selective nature of its rescue fades into institutional logic. The question that opened this investigation, who paid the price while others were protected, remains, but it is no longer the headline. It is a footnote waiting in the margins of a reform that would soon redefine American finance. On May 30th, 1908, the improvisation of October 1907 crossed a constitutional threshold. What had been negotiated in private libraries and clearinghouse rooms was now codified in federal statute. The National Monetary Commission, created under the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, signed into law that day, was not presented as a response to unequal rescue. It was presented as a rational answer to systemic fragility. The panic of 1907 was formally declared evidence that the United States required structural reform in its monetary architecture. That declaration did more than authorize study. It converted a crisis, shaped by private command, into a legislative mandate. The action of power here was explicit. On May 30th, 1908, Congress declared the necessity of a formal inquiry into the nation's banking system and authorized the National Monetary Commission to examine, compare, and recommend institutional redesign. This was not an academic exercise. It was a federally sanctioned acknowledgement that the existing framework had failed to prevent panic. The consequence was immediate in political terms. The crisis of 1907 became the official justification for structural transformation, initiating a chain of events that would culminate 5 years later in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The line from panic to reform appears clean when described in sequence. Panic exposes weakness, weakness prompts commission, commission produces debate, debate yields institutional redesign. But the clarity of that line conceals something more complicated. The panic had not been resolved through statutory authority. It had been stabilized through private coordination, supplemented by executive alignment. The system survived because individuals with concentrated influence compelled commitments under pressure. The law that followed did not investigate that mechanism as a potential imbalance of power. Instead, it focused on the absence of a lender of last resort as the central deficiency. The panic of 1907 was treated in official framing as final proof that the United States could not rely on fragmented reserves and Decentralized banking relationships. European central banks were studied as models precisely because they possess the authority to inject liquidity systematically. The narrative became structural inevitability. Without centralized elasticity, crises would recur. This reasoning was technically sound, yet it also allowed the country to absorb the lesson without revisiting the distributional consequences of the rescue itself. The contrast is stark. In October 1907, stabilization depended on private selection. In May 1908, reform was described as the rational correction of design flaws. The improvisation of elites was translated into process. What had been the authority of individuals to extract commitments behind closed doors became the authority of a commission to study and recommend formal power. The system did not repudiate private coordination. It institutionalized the need for a centralized operator. The deeper investigative tension lies in what the Commission did not treat as its subject. It did not interrogate the hierarchy of exposure that defined November 1907. It did not center the merchants denied credit renewal or the wage earners dismissed as collateral contraction. The social cost of selective stabilization became background context for structural modernization. The reform discourse focused on prevention rather than redistribution. The question shifted from who paid to how do we prevent recurrence. And yet the creation of the National Monetary Commission had consequences beyond study. It concentrated intellectual authority. The Commission's membership, travel, research, and report writing shaped the vocabulary through which Americans would understand financial crises. Its findings would inform Congress, guide debate, and structure the eventual blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. In that sense, the Panic of 1907 did not merely justify reform, it accelerated the consolidation of financial governance into a more formalized center. There is an irony here that deserves attention. The crisis demonstrated that informal networks could stabilize markets under pressure. But reliance on those networks revealed the vulnerability of a system without statutory elasticity. Reform thus sought to replace personal command with institutional command. What had been a matter of reputation and proximity would become a matter of legal mandate and structured authority. The private operator would be superseded by a public central bank. Yet, institutionalization does not erase origin. The intellectual impetus for reform came directly from a crisis navigated by elites acting in concert. The emergency revealed both the necessity and the danger of concentrated authority. The reform that followed sought to capture the stabilizing capacity without replicating the opacity. But whether that balance was achieved remains an open question. On May 30th, 1908, the law did not mention depositors who stood in line outside shuttered trust companies. It did not recount the nights in private libraries. It did not document which institutions were saved and which were sacrificed. It spoke in the language of efficiency, coordination, and monetary science. That language was forward-looking. It implied progress. It implied that the nation had learned. The consequence of that implication was historical reframing. The Panic of 1907 became the foundational argument for central banking reform. It was cited in debates, printed in reports, and referenced in speeches as the cautionary tale that proved fragility. What faded from emphasis was the unevenness of survival within the panic itself. The system's redesign was presented as collective advancement, not as an institutional response to a crisis managed by a narrow circle. And so the legacy begins here, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a legislative act signed on a late May afternoon. The improvisation of October was translated into statute. The private architecture of crisis became the blueprint for public redesign. The United States moved one step closer to the creation of a formal lender of last resort. The question that lingers is whether the law corrected the imbalance of selective power or merely relocated it. The image that remains is procedural and quiet, a signed Act of Congress dated May 30th, 1908, authorizing study and reform, ink drying beneath a presidential signature. Behind that ink stands the memory of a crisis navigated by private hands. Ahead of it stands a new architecture of authority still under construction, carrying forward both the promise of stability and the unresolved tension of who truly pays when systems are saved. On December 23, 1913, the United States formalized what 1907 had improvised. The Federal Reserve System was signed into existence, not as an abstract theory, but as a direct institutional response to the instability exposed 6 years earlier. The Federal Reserve Act did not mention J.P. Morgan's library, nor did it recount the nights of extracted commitments and restricted credit. It spoke instead in the language of elasticity, reserve centralization, and financial stability. Yet the shadow of 1907 was embedded in every line. The crisis had demonstrated that liquidity, when controlled by a narrow circle, could determine survival. The law now sought to institutionalize that control within a permanent structure. The action of power was explicit and constitutional. On December 23, 1913, Congress declared the establishment of a central banking mechanism authorized to issue currency, provide emergency lending, and coordinate national monetary policy. This was not improvisation under duress. It was the deliberate creation of a new authority designed to function as lender of last resort. The consequence was structural and enduring. The United States would no longer rely on a single private operator to orchestrate stability during panic. The capacity to inject liquidity would reside in a federally chartered system. But institutionalization does not eliminate power. It redistributes it. The Federal Reserve reduced dependence on a man in a library, yet it created a new center of authority capable of influencing credit conditions across the nation. The argument was sound. Stability requires elasticity. A lender of last resort can prevent cascading collapse. But the investigative question remains intact. Whoever controls the timing and scale of liquidity controls the rhythm of the market. The panic of 1907 became a permanent reference point in defense of central banking. It was cited as proof that decentralized reserves and fragmented institutions were insufficient in a modern industrial economy. The narrative framed 1907 as the final demonstration that improvisation was not sustainable governance. That framing was accurate, yet it also ensured that the memory of unequal exposure was subordinated to the necessity of reform. The urgency of preventing future collapse eclipsed the moral imbalance of the last one. The Federal Reserve's creation represented a transformation of authority from private networks to public institution. But public institution does not mean absence of discretion. It means discretion codified within law. The Board of Governors and the regional Federal Reserve banks would possess the authority to expand or contract liquidity, to influence discount rates, to determine how and when emergency credit would be extended. Stability became an administered function. There is no conspiracy in this evolution. There is consequence. A system that experienced severe contraction and witnessed private triage under pressure sought a mechanism to prevent repetition. The reform was not reactionary. It was rational. Yet rational reform carries embedded assumptions. It assumes that centralized authority can be exercised with neutrality. It assumes that institutional safeguards can replace reputational command. It assumes that formal processes are inherently more equitable than informal agreements. The tension lies in the permanence of justification. Once 1907 became the foundational argument for central banking, it became a recurring reference in later crises. The memory of selective rescue and uneven exposure was transformed into an argument for centralized capacity. The system learned that stability must be engineered in advance, but it also learned that emergency authority, once created, becomes part of the governing structure indefinitely. The Federal Reserve System institutionalized the function that had been improvised by private actors. It provided mechanisms for discounting commercial paper, redistributing reserves, and acting as lender of last resort. In doing so, it reduced the probability that future panics would depend on the presence of a single influential financier. That was an undeniable advancement. Yet it also concentrated influence within a smaller circle of legally empowered decision-makers. The social consequence was subtle but profound. Markets no longer waited for a private meeting to determine survival. They looked to a centralized authority. Confidence became linked not to an individual reputation, but to institutional credibility. The crisis management of 1907 had been personal and opaque. The Federal Reserve was designed to be systemic and procedural, but procedure does not remove discretion. It channels it. By December 23, 1913, the improvisation of elite coordination had matured into statute. The country possessed a formal lender of last resort. The financial system gained a structured mechanism for elasticity. Yet the fundamental principle revealed in 1907 remained. The authority to supply liquidity determines who withstands contraction and who does not. The difference is that the authority now carried the weight of federal law. The birth of the Federal Reserve System was not a repudiation of the need for stability. It was the acceptance of that need as permanent. The panic of 1907 became the cautionary tale embedded in institutional memory. Stability was elevated to a public good requiring centralized oversight, but centralized oversight, by definition, concentrates power. The architecture of financial governance shifted from private salons to federal boards. The stakes did not diminish, they expanded. The image that remains at the close of this chapter is restrained and procedural. A presidential signature dated December 23, 1913, beneath a statute establishing the Federal Reserve System. Outside the room, markets continue, wages rise and fall, credit expands and contracts. The mechanism is no longer improvised, it is embedded. The question that endures is not whether stability is necessary. It is who shapes its boundaries and whose exposure remains unseen when the system is saved. In 1906, 1 year before the panic that would test the nation's financial architecture, a building rose in Midtown Manhattan that was never intended to look like a bank. The structure, commissioned by J.P. Morgan and designed by McKim, Mead and White, under the direction of Charles Follen McKim, was completed as a private library. It did not advertise itself as a center of command. It presented itself as culture, marble, proportion, symmetry, silence. Yet architecture is not neutral. It communicates hierarchy long before any decision is made within its walls. The action of power embedded in 1906 was aesthetic but deliberate. Morgan and his architects declared permanence through stone, classical proportions, restrained ornament, thick walls, limited access points. The entrance did not invite traffic, it managed it. The facade did not project urgency, it projected order. This was not accidental. In an era defined by industrial expansion and volatile markets, the building asserted continuity. It conveyed that inside these walls, the world was curated, catalogued, and controlled. The consequence was not merely symbolic. When October 1907 arrived and financial leaders gathered in that space, the setting did not decorate the event. It framed it. Decisions extracted under pressure were enveloped by architecture designed to signal authority without spectacle. Silence, stone, and symmetry functioned as a kind of moral backdrop. The room itself reinforced the legitimacy of command. A commitment signed under those ceilings felt less like capitulation and more like stewardship. That psychological effect is not incidental. It is part of how power sustains itself. Mansions and libraries enter this investigation not as fetish objects, but as evidence of structural logic. In 1906, the completion of Morgan's library formalized a private domain capable of hosting decisions outside public scrutiny. The building's restricted access was not unusual for a private residence, but when private residence becomes de facto crisis headquarters, access becomes political. In a panic, who controls the door controls the flow of negotiation. And architecture determines how easily that door can be closed. The library's interior was designed for curated knowledge. Manuscripts were catalogued, artifacts were preserved, nothing entered the collection without deliberation. The space implied that judgment was careful, informed, elevated above noise. That implication matters. When financial leaders convened there in 1907, the building itself suggested that deliberation was rational, not coercive. The marble softened the urgency. The controlled lighting insulated the room from the chaos outside. It created an environment where decisions about liquidity and survival could be framed as reasoned necessity rather than emergency triage. The deeper investigative point is not about aesthetics, it is about access. Public institutions, courthouses, city halls, legislative chambers are built to accommodate visibility. They may not always provide transparency, but they are structurally open to it. The Morgan Library was not built for public witness. Its exclusivity was architectural fact. The panic of 1907 demonstrated that in moments of systemic stress, the locus of control could migrate from visible civic space to curated private interior. That migration altered the relationship between authority and accountability. Charles Follen McKim did not design a financial command center. He designed a temple of culture. Yet temples confer legitimacy. The quiet discipline of classical architecture conveys inevitability. When leaders gather in such a space, the setting reduces dissent. It implies continuity with tradition. In 1907, that implication mattered. The men inside the library could interpret their actions as preservation of order rather than exercise of selective power. The building reinforced that interpretation. The consequence for the public was indirect but real. When decisions determining liquidity, rescue, and institutional survival are made in a space structurally insulated from public observation, the public's role contracts to reaction. The library did not create inequality. It provided the environment in which inequality could be managed without spectacle. Architecture cannot eliminate moral tension. It can absorb it. In 1906, the completion of the Morgan Library crystallized a broader reality of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Wealth was not only financial, it was spatial. Those who possessed capital could construct environments that amplified their authority. The marble facade communicated that what happened inside belonged to a different register of judgment than what occurred on the street. In a crisis, that difference becomes decisive. The symbol persists because it condenses the narrative. A library suggests knowledge. Knowledge suggests prudence. Prudence suggests legitimacy. The chain is subtle but powerful. When financial stabilization is negotiated in such a setting, the outcome feels elevated above ordinary dispute. The public may resent the consequences, but the architecture discourages the language of protest. It frames action as responsibility. The investigative thread here is not nostalgia, it is recognition that power often embeds itself in material form long before it is exercised. The Morgan Library, completed in 1906, stood ready before the panic erupted. It was an infrastructure of discretion, waiting for an event. When that event arrived in October 1907, the building did what architecture does best. It organized behavior. It limited who entered. It defined where. Negotiations occurred. It insulated decision-makers from noise. It allowed commitments to be extracted under conditions of composure. In crises, the question of who controls doors becomes literal. Doors are not metaphors when liquidity is scarce. Doors determine access to funds, to negotiation, to influence. The library's controlled entrances symbolized a broader pattern. Financial power concentrated behind thresholds the public could not cross. The building did not cause the panic. It framed the response. And so the image that remains from 1906 is austere. Marble columns, bronze doors, a controlled vestibule leading into a chamber of curated quiet. Years later, in October 1907, that chamber would host decisions shaping the fate of institutions and depositors alike. The architecture did not speak, it did not vote, it did not sign, but it reinforced the logic that in moments of instability, those who control space often control destiny. By January 1914, the markets had steadied, the legislation had been signed, and the language had shifted. What had once been called panic was now referred to as reform. What had been negotiated in private rooms was reclassified as institutional evolution. And on Wall Street, no longer a street alone, but a social system of memory and omission, the episode began to settle into myth. The story hardened into something clean. There had been danger. There had been leadership. There had been decisive action in a critical hour. The closed door became legend. The signature became salvation. The room became symbol. The narrative required no footnotes about shuttered storefronts or wages reduced to silence. It required only a hero, a chamber, and a system reborn. In this transformation, the episode ceased to be conflict and became instruction. It was retold as proof that America had matured, that it had learned, that it had erected something permanent where improvisation once stood. The Federal Reserve System, signed into law weeks earlier in December 1913, was cited as the institutional answer to the instability of 1907. The architecture of crisis management had been redesigned. A private operator had been replaced by a formal mechanism. A library had given way to a boardroom. A signature on marble had become statute on parchment, but permanence does not erase origin. Wall Street, as a living structure of influence, retained its own continuity. The methods evolved. The vocabulary changed. Panic became liquidity event. Private rescue became systemic stabilization, yet the essential principle endured. Whoever controls access controls consequence. Whoever defines necessity defines memory, and whoever narrates reform determines which costs are archived and which are absorbed into silence. By early 1914, the corridors that had once echoed with urgency returned to measured calm. Documents were catalogued. Reports were bound, ledgers were balanced. The Morgan Library stood unchanged in its marble restraint, no longer the stage of emergency, yet still the emblem of insulated authority. The Federal Reserve's founding did not dismantle the architecture of control. It formalized it. The method survived, only under another name. The question remains suspended in that marble air. Who paid the price while others were protected? The answer is not carved into stone. It was never intended to be. Instead, it lingers in the quiet aftermath, in the businesses that did not reopen, in the wage ledgers adjusted downward, in the Families who absorbed contraction without ever entering the room where commitments were extracted. The cost was real, the attribution was diffuse, and diffusion is the most durable form of invisibility. History prefers coherence. It favors narratives of rescue over inventories of loss. It elevates architects of reform while softening the contours of exposure. By January 1914, the panic of 1907 had become part of a larger institutional arc, a stepping stone toward modern finance. The discomfort of selective salvation receded behind the promise of structural stability, but beyond the golden halls, the silence is not absence, it is preservation. Behind every formal reform lies the memory of the informal method that preceded it. Behind every statute lies the pressure that justified it, and behind every stabilized system lies the unrecorded ledger of those who steadied it without consent. The doors that closed in October 1907 did not vanish. They were redesigned. The marble remained. The language adapted. The authority endured. If you wish to remain within these halls as further sealed records surface, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens, stay with us. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Because some secrets are not destroyed, they are reorganized. And some survive only because those who feared them left no one willing to record the full cost.